to do a quick level set, and when it comes to guided pathways and the work that we're venturing forth on, we have the 4 pillars. So when I think back to reading the book, Redesigning America's Community Colleges, and our first institute at Monroe, and thinking about wrapping my head around the 4 pillars, and then at Rockland, started working curriculum mapping and what are the pieces, parts, and as we've continued along, and I've personally continued along the journey, it's not just the 4 pillars, it's building on those 4 pillars of creating pathways, also got to rethink dev ed and increasing advising capacity. As Melinda was talking about, it doesn't necessarily mean more advisors, but it's about capacity. Front-loading career services, and as Kay McClenny says in the AACC Guided Pathways program, it's inescapable supports. And then equity at scale. And to peel that back just a little bit, the curriculum mapping, it is large-scale change. The creating pathways is about curriculum mapping and creating the meta majors, and is focusing here these next 2 days on rethinking our intake processes and how they connect to holistic support. To do that, it's new cross-functional strategies, which gets to those roles and responsibilities that Melinda was talking about. It's infusion of data, and as we learned 2 weeks ago in Arizona at the Guided Pathways 2.0 Institute, boy, this work is going to expose our technology gaps. We're going to, as we look closer to our data and we're pounded by vendors for those technological solutions, we need to heed Melinda's warnings there about the solutions aren't always what the vendors say they'll be. And then the equity conversations. For us, our work in achieving the dream over the last several years has introduced the issues of equity, but wow, getting deeper into these the guided pathways work, particularly in this, where we are as a society right now, these equity conversations are, I say, unprecedented, certainly for me, and I think for many of us. Talking with presidents in Arizona, we may think it's about structures and processes and things that we might think we may be somewhat good at, but it's those attitudes and normative behaviors that Melinda mentioned around equity. We can't dismiss those or underestimate the power of those conversations. So as we think about this large-scale change, although we're talking student intake, I want to zoom out for a minute for the next 40 minutes or so. And for those of you that heard Melinda yesterday, she did mention that to take all of this to scale, we have to do it all at once. You can't just tweak around the edges. So she quietly finished her sentence of something like, so we have to build the car as we're driving, build the plane as we're flying it. And so then there's building the plane as you're flying it. And then I thought, well, actually, it's the true transformation is we're putting wings on the car while we're driving down the runway to make the car fly, is really what it is for me. And the level of how we go about that is the real challenge. Because when I think about the change and true transformation, it is how do we stay relevant? Because if the industry needs flying cars and we're focused on just making the best little car we can driving down the road, we're going to run the risk of being irrelevant. So 3 things. I hope you capture all of this as I talk, but the 3 main thrusts. How do we maintain relevance amid great change? How do we think about change? And how do we think about our culture? So those are the 3 big things I want to get into. So remaining relevant. Any of you seen Rick Warren, the Saddleback Church, 100-some thousand people in his congregation? He has a great TED Talk on relevance. Awesome, great. It's only 12 minutes. I won't do the whole thing here, but a couple of key things that he says. He said to remain relevant, If change is occurring outside your organization faster than change is occurring inside your organization, you're going to run the risk of becoming irrelevant. So thinking about what change is occurring outside of our organization and thinking how hard change is inside our organizations. What's on my mind of late is thinking of guided pathways is actually just a precursor. To think beyond guided pathways, those first 2 slides, there's so much, it's almost overwhelming. But as fast as change is happening, I think it's important for us to just take a pause here, just 45 minutes after lunch, to think about how fast things are moving and where things will be 5, 10 years from now. So the idea of culture and talking about our organizational culture here today in the context of guided pathways, as we go through our guided pathways work, the extent to which we can be intentional and thoughtful about shaping going about our guided pathways work in a way that shapes our organizational culture to the aspirational culture we want. The decisions we make for how we go about our guided pathways work will reinforce certain elements of our culture. We have decisions to make for how we go about this work. And the way we do that can reinforce the best aspects of our organizational culture. Because I am concerned about this notion of relevance and the speed at which change is occurring outside of our organizations. Tom Friedman, who wrote many of you may have read The World is Flat. Well, his latest book is called Thank You for Being Late, An Optimist's Guide to the Age of Acceleration. So he's trying to think about, gosh, change is happening so much faster these days. I wonder why. So he started looking into that, and then he kept tripping across this year of 2007. And in 2007, Google, he starts off, in 2007, Steve Jobs introduced the iPhone with Apple. That same year, Google introduced the Android platform. In 2007, Google also launched its Office suite of Google Docs. And in 2007, Google bought a little video company named YouTube. In 2007, Airbnb was launched. Facebook went global. Twitter became its own platform. IBM launched the Watson project, which began the artificial intelligence. Amazon launched the Kindle, the first electronic reader, as well as Amazon launched the first cloud services. It was the beginning of the cloud as we know it in 2007. Hadoop is a free software that really launched big data analytics and predictive analytics is done on the Hadoop software. And GitHub is the largest open-sourced coding platform with 14 million users in the world. All of that happened in 2007. And you're like, wow, I was there. I was alive. Why did I pay attention to that? Well, because all that happened in 2007, as he says, our technological world changed in 2007, and what happened in 2008? Our fiscal and social world was turned upside down with the Great Recession, so we missed it. And yet that has seen, and then he goes on to have several different, splicing the DNA and several other indicators where almost no change, just level equilibrium, and then a hockey stick, as he calls it. It just goes up from 2007. Everything's accelerated from there. So that has affected nearly every industry. But thank God we work in education and we don't have to worry about a thing. But we're starting to see that we are not immune, and we're starting to see books published, like things called the college disrupted, the great unbundling of higher education. And then Gary Bowles, got to take my glasses off up top, Unbundling Higher Education, How the Internet Evaporates the Middle. And Gary Bowles is the director of, he chairs the Future of Work Initiative for Singularity University, which is connected to the Google and Amazon and Apples of the world. So this notion of eliminating the middle, you then see it in Peter Smith's book, Free Range Learning in the Digital Age, that was just released this summer. And he talks about higher education used to be this oasis in the middle of a desert, a knowledge oasis in the desert, where people would trek across the desert to go to this one place of knowledge. And isn't it great? That's the place and the only place you could go. And now, as he argues, higher ed needs to realize that the desert is gone and it's actually a lush green meadow and forest, whatever it is. It's no longer the oasis because knowledge can be gained anywhere. And they call it the parchment ceiling. How is it that someone can have all the skills they need to do the job, but no degree or no parchment, and someone over here has the parchment but marginal skills and probably can't do the job as well as the person without the parchment, or with the parchment, without the parchment? That's the breaking point. That is going to change over the next 5 years, 5 to 10 years. Those institutions that start getting into the validation of learning. How do we validate learning? How do we validate competencies? For me, that's on the other side of guided pathways. And that is a brain freeze of think of our cultures and how many of us are ready. Oh, sure, just competency-based education. We'll just flip it. But we got all the excuses, the Carnegie hours and federal financial aid and all those excuses. Those could change with a stroke of a pen. And if we're not preparing our organizations and our cultures to be thinking about that in the future, we're going to be caught in the headlights there. So how do we think about this with that kind of change happening? And what kind of change are we seeing outside of our organization? So here's a 1-minute video. Some of you may have seen this on 60 Minutes, but I find it fascinating. Takes a moment to load. Come on, Bri, where are you? Where's my mouse? Oh, and then I can't find the mouse.
6,
Oh.
8.
But I can't get it back. There we go.
1.
6 and 8, very important numbers.
What is 45,689 divided by 67?
Sure.
He silently asks the computer and then hears the answer through vibrations transmitted through his skull and into his inner ear.
6, 8, 1.9, 2, 5.
Exactly right.
One more. What's the largest city in Bulgaria, and what is the population?
The screen shows how long it takes the computer to read the words that he's saying to himself.
Sofia, 1.21 million.
That is correct. You just Googled that.
I did.
You could be an expert in any subject.
Mm-hmm.
You have the entire internet in your head.
That's the idea.
That's something else, right? So then for me, I think of something like GPS. And GPS, although it was first invented by the military in 1973 with the satellites and all, and stayed in the military for about 20 years, late 80s, early 90s became a little more commercialized and opened up, and then you get a platform like a cell phone, and within 20 years it's ubiquitous. What platform will that kind of technology connect to? That's all done. This episode on 60 Minutes was the MIT, they call it the Idea Factory, and it's the MIT Media Lab. And they were working with, they called it turn-by-turn directional in 1987. And several major technologies coming out of MIT, the robotics and Boston Dynamics, they've spun out tons of artificial intelligence companies in Boston coming out of the MIT Media Lab. And he is a graduate student who had this idea to connect the brain to the internet, and that they're funding him to do that. And the Media Lab, who's it funded by? How do you get there? What's it all about? The MIT Media Lab is a membership organization that has about a $500,000 annual membership fee. And the members are Google, Amazon, Apple, Walmart, and others. That allows them first access to their technology, to their patents. So right now we're wrestling with faculty just being fact-checked in real time by students with their phones, but that's like a whole nother level. So what will be our role in a world where that, in 10, 15 years, is far more the norm? So that definitely speaks to the need for change. And as we think about change, well, we as humans, change in our DNA is really not our thing, because if you go back to our time in the caves, in the cave dwelling, in our kind of lizard brain part, change is a bad thing, because any change in our daily routine could mean you die. We need predictability in our lives. We need to feel safe and secure, and change becomes a very emotional thing for us. We have our reactions, our perceptions, and our feelings. And how does that line up with substantive organizational change? I did my dissertation on factors that influence the perception of change. So I asked 500 faculty and staff in the community college system in Colorado and asked them about their perceptions of change. And the number one finding, the highest correlation, was the extent to which people could put change into a larger context. The more they understood why. And I thought, wow, that's a really powerful correlation. And my committee, a member of my committee said, wow, you just spent the last 3 years of your life researching and confirming human nature. I was like, wow. But it is true. So how do we go through that and help people through that? We need to think about a model for change. I thought it was interesting. I liked Melinda's model for change that she gave us, very practical and kind of tactical of how we move through change as an organization. But then you get into that, the lime green level of figuring out what our institutional model is and how we change our roles and responsibilities. That gets into the human, what about me? What's going to happen to me and my job? That's when it starts to clog up a little bit. So I've subscribed to the punctuated equilibrium model. If there are any biologists in the room, this kind of comes out of biology. Yeah, Shannon, hi. Hopefully it works for you. The punctuated equilibrium model, as you think about our organizations as living things, living organisms, living organisms go through periods of stability, equilibrium, and then they go through periods of great change, these punctuations. That's when the change really occurs, and how species evolve. How some, they lose their tail. Well, when they lost their tail, that was a punctuation. And then they go through another 1,000,000 years of equilibrium until they change something else about themselves. We as organizations have the same kind of model. So if we go through 5 leadership changes over 12 years, you can't get traction on anything, and it's just kind of equilibrium, and we're just enrolling students and managing our enrollment, no real change. So that it's been so long since we've had a punctuation. New person comes in, whatever new leadership comes in, tries to change things. Oh, change is so hard because we haven't changed in so long. The other way is that we have so much change, there's so much punctuation, there's no time for equilibrium, and just get exhausted in the constant change. So trying to find a way to strike a balance between having enough change so that you're, as Jen DeWorth has said at our colleges, we've talked about this, the change is kind of like a muscle. The more you use it in the right way with good form and good exercise, it makes the muscle stronger. So if you can strike a balance between periods of equilibrium and periods of punctuation, the punctuations aren't so significant and dramatic, with the word drama in there, aren't so dramatic that you're able to manage change a little better with more consistent, reasonable, strategic change with managed periods of equilibrium in between. The challenge is guided pathways is going to be a huge punctuation. So what do you do in the equilibrium period in the ramp up for that, prior to that, to try to be thinking about your culture and the impact on the organization. One more slide on change, and I really like this one. I used to think about this 7-stage period of change. that has a little more emotion to it. And I could even give you my take on an example of this. So, you know, the x-axis up goes the shock. So when we launched Achieving the Dream, people were a little shocked. It did kind of come out of nowhere a little bit. And then everybody, well, it's not going to hit denial. Who cares? It's disbelief. It doesn't matter. It's not going to affect me. And then as it started to roll out a little further, faculty needed to be involved, got a little frustrated, and then depressed because we didn't have the right faculty involved. And then over time, as time went on, those that were involved started to experiment a little bit, engage a little bit more, kind of got a little more traction and started changing some of the conversations around equity and data to the point that we had, I'd say, that critical mass moving forward with Achieving the Dream to the point that 3 years later, in terms of integrated, when it got to moving to guided pathways, it was like, hey, guided pathways is there. We should do guided pathways. It's like the next thing beyond Achieving the Dream, and it's integrated and it connects. That was kind of a normal cycle within the organization, but as individuals move through this, I couldn't help but see some of the, denial. Hey, denial's in the Kubler-Ross 5 stages of grief. Anger, frustration, bargaining. As you move through the anger, then you start bargaining a little in your depression, and then acceptance. And going back to Rick Warren's TED Talk, he talks about change as, I want to make sure I get this right, he said, there is no growth without change, no change without loss, no loss without pain, and no pain without grief. And that change comes with grief. Grief is a natural part of change. And he says, Rick Warren says, fear, resentment, bitterness, pride, and unwillingness to change, all of those will kill your organization. But grief will not. You need to learn to honor the past without perpetuating the past, which is a really powerful phrase, I think, for all of us to hold on to. You need to learn from the past without perpetuating the past, and sort out what we need to honor and continue, and what we need, and maybe even perpetuate, but what we need to stop doing and change going forward. We're all products of the past, but we don't need to be prisoners of it. And he said, so, as Melinda was talking about the cranky pants or whatever, around change, we all have those, but if there's clear vision and clear reasons for change, and as she said, you're changing someone's job, that's change for them, and they need time to grieve, and you need to support them through that. And for me, that's a whole reframing, because I think all of us spend so much time in conversations as we move through change. We stereotype people greatly when we talk about equity work. There's some equity work among faculty and staff and how we think of our colleagues as it relates to change. Oh, so-and-so just doesn't like change. They're out. We just won't include them because they don't like change. And you need to reframe that and use this lens. Is it really, are they really just cranky pants in every aspect of their life? Or are they grieving some sense of loss of trying to work through this aspect of change? So with that, I've been talking just 10 minutes or so. I just want to pause, not big workshop because I only have 45 minutes. Just take like 1 minute and reflect on your colleagues and reflect on your institution by yourself quietly. Just think about one person that might fit that with this in mind, might you recast and reframe that relationship with that person? Someone who's stereotyped and is in the hallway buzz of so-and-so doesn't fit, they don't like change. And with this model in mind, might you go back to that person in a different light and see them in a different light, thinking that they might not be so cranky, that they might just be grieving and need support and need connection to work through change as we think about guided pathways and the significance that it may entail. Just think about one person and who that person might be. And then think about the extent to which you might reach out to that person and reconnect with them in a different way and bring them along through change. Because this very human element to change gets to the heart of organizational culture. Guided Pathways forces us to look at our policies, procedures, systems, and processes, a lot of the tactical stuff that Melinda was talking about, but in the adaptive space, Guided Pathways has attitude, changes in normative behaviors. At its core, Guided Pathways is about the significant artifacts of our human enterprise that's carried out every day in our culture. We can have the best strategies in the world, but as Peter Drucker says, culture eats strategy for breakfast. And yet, what is culture? We don't spend enough time as professionals really thinking about culture. We might say, oh, it's the culture, it's the way things are done around here. That's the culture. We never think about how we might shape our culture. And what are the levers that we can, the more we spend time thinking about these levers for how we can shape and change our culture for the better every day, as a collection of humans working together in what really is a living organism of our organization, the more we can think, we can have better strategies that are aligned with our culture. So a couple of slides on what culture is. Edgar Schein kind of wrote the seminal work on culture. At the foundation is our assumptions and beliefs, often unconscious, which gets into the equity discussions and the elements of bias that we need to unpack to make some of the calls and the strategies. We have to be very aware of those perceptions, thoughts, and feelings, because at the end of the day, those are the ultimate source of our values and our actions. So building on those assumptions and beliefs is our espoused values that take form in our strategies, our goals, and our vision that you can feel a little more so than the artifacts that you can actually touch and see within an organization. These are the structures, the processes, the decisions that are very clear and transparent. Another way to view it is culture as an iceberg, where those artifacts are the events and patterns at the top of an iceberg, but so much of culture you can't see. The way things are done around here, the incredible number of workarounds that we all have. Those are in the underlying structures and the mental models that we have that you can't see as well. And yet Guided Pathways is going to test every last one of those. So to be aware of those and be thinking about surfacing those in a way, making sure we're clear on our cultural values, the core beliefs, and that they're shared at a time when in our private lives, so many of our employees at the college, faculty, and our colleagues reflect the rest of the institution with great divides of values and beliefs, struggling with ways to connect and have civil conversations about things that really matter. Our culture is going to get in the way of implementing Guided Pathways if we don't tend to it. So perhaps, I was thinking about this last night, just wondering if we might find ways to lower the water level in this picture, to have those underlying structures a little more transparent within our culture. So and that's a nice segue to the next piece that as we think about water, last metaphor for culture is first paragraph of chapter 1 in the book, turned into a video, that culture is like a river. So just kind of 2-minute meditation on culture. All of this as a way to think about culture. Narrated by Mary Rosianis, by the way.
Organizational culture is like a river. It is in constant motion and yet maintains a distinct and ever-forward flow. Every river has a story with a beginning that precedes countless changes, whether subtle or sudden, that comprise its current features. As with culture, every newcomer enters the river from a different place, never able to enter the same point twice in the ongoing current. Likewise, those who stand in the river for a long time struggle to describe it. They just know they are in it. And so it goes with culture. Like a river, culture shapes the organizational landscape around it, determining where the curves, narrows, and falls are. It has deep pockets that are not easy to see or understand, as well as shallow areas that can attract debris and unwanted material. Sudden violent storms and flash floods of significant disruption can dramatically alter its route, while drought and a dearth of resources can test its resilience and ultimate survival. And like the fast-moving whitewater rapids found in some rivers, the rough periods that occur within a culture can cause great uncertainty.
So I'm thinking about the force of a river and the force of culture, and how do you change that? For me, as I think about that, it's this notion of this great quote from Broadway director Anne Bogart. She says, "You cannot create results, you can only create conditions in which something might happen." So this goes to that notion of the incredible intentionality that we need to have as we go about this work, for who's in the room, what decision gets made at what level, who's part of the decision-making process, what's the sequence in which things need to be rolled out, if all of those elements of guided pathways have to roll out at scale. What's the sequence for what piece do you put together first, and in what way and in what sequence, so that when you roll it out, the students have a connected experience and it's not piecemeal. Because this is guided pathways is certainly not about tweaking around the edges. That's what we've been doing as a sector for 30 plus years. So in thinking about culture change, I think about Jim Collins in his book Good to Great. We talked about this notion that organizations that went from good to great and made that leap were comprised of disciplined people with disciplined thought, taking disciplined action. And that goes to not jumping to the tactical solution, but really staying tethered in that adaptive space, looking at data, and then asking the why. There's one thing we've learned from Achieving the Dream. It's you look at your data, but before you jump to a solution, you ask why the data is the way it is. And I think that's so important. And what's great about Guided Pathways is I think ATD introduced us to just using the data. And as Rob Johnstone said, it's more about the lagging indicators, or his words, oh crap measures. Graduation rate, 3 years, oh crap, it's not what I hoped it was. Now I got to wait 3 years to get more results for the next students. And in the meantime, multiple folks have graduated or fallen off their path. Well, Guided Pathways is about leading indicators, knowing what's happening at the end of their first semester. And then asking why the data are the way they are. So that's some of the disciplined thought and the disciplined action. And in my experience, I identified these 5 phases of changing culture. And it's this notion of surfacing it, talking about it, identifying it, defining it, describing it, and then touching it with some low-risk changes or prototypes or pilots, and see how the culture reacts. And learning from that, and then taking a little more higher risk changes and moving it for bigger results. And going through that, too many organizations, I think they just get so focused on trying to drive the results or moving the culture, they skip those first 2 and they end up having to backtrack. But going in this motion, a little more patient, a little more long-term, you get the results, and then those results are kind of a positive, a reinforcing mechanism that move the organization to have a sense of momentum about it. So yeah, organizational culture change in its entirety. The number I've heard from several leaders is about 10 years. As I look back on my time as an academic VP, I was 8 years. The first 5 years were built like this. In the last 3 years, it was solid momentum. But it's maybe 1 year instead of 2, maybe at a division level. At a department level, you might be able to do it in, say, 6 months per phase, which is still 2 years just in a single department. So to be thinking about change in that way. And then I mentioned levers for culture change. These 5 are the ones that in my research for the book kind of came together. Is at the foundation is understanding the why, going back to my dissertation research and human nature of the more people can put change into context, the better. When it comes to guided pathways, it may be, what is the why of guided pathways? And every institution has its own arc and own space to occupy. So in some, it might be social justice, equity, breaking the intergenerational cycle of poverty, the student experience, workforce development. Any one of those could be part of or all of the why folks are doing pursuing guided pathways. And then leadership and trust, building on that, leadership at all levels. The organization has to find ways to support leadership at all levels and empowering folks closest to the decision. This guided pathways really is, what fascinates me the most through this process is how it inherently involves teams of content experts have to be at the table to help figure this out. This is not a couple of senior leaders or administrators going off on a retreat or something and coming back and saying, here, look what we're going to do. This is fundamental and very integrated into the work that we do need leadership at all levels. The trust comes with transparency. Trust comes with a focus on creating connections within your institution. How do you reinforce those connections? What's re-examining your communications within your organization, and supporting your supervisors, developing your supervisors. As people manage and navigate these role changes, supervisors are gonna have to be in the know, have to be engaged and supportive and supporting people as they go through the emotions associated with change. And across most of our organizations, our supervisors, it's not exactly consistent across the board. As the Gallup organization's research shows, most people don't leave organizations, they leave supervisors. So we in the larger whole as an organization, how can we support supervisors within the culture? Employee engagement, that goes to professional development, recognition. Think about shared governance and how the extent to which we go through our guided pathways work, how do we engage our shared governance systems to reinforce cultures that really bring everybody into the process, as well as roles and responsibilities, kind of making it safe for change and supporting, looking closely at our evaluation and feedback systems that as roles change, well, we want to make sure that you've got legitimate and meaningful evaluation systems in place that will reinforce the best aspects of your culture. Data and inquiry, as I mentioned, the lagging to leading indicators, but then also looking at your data infrastructure, making tough choices to reallocate resources in the same way we reallocate resources for advising and rethink that. We need to do the same with our institutional research staff. And how can we create systems that get data out to users in meaningful ways that are easy to use? Having conversations about who has access to what data. How do you make sure your data is clean? And really spending time thinking about your data infrastructure. And then finally, the anticipation. And I really like that one because going back to the earlier slides and earlier videos, I should say, how do we anticipate? How do you create a mechanism within your institution to look beyond your strategic plan just 5 years? So an example of that at MVCC, we're the MVCC Hawks, go Hawks. We have what we call Hawk Vision, which is a group of faculty and staff, many of whom are oriented to the future, strategic thinkers. They constant scanners in their personal life, and they get together on a regular basis, and their task is to scan information and look for trends that are going to affect the college 5 years and beyond. And then the goal is just find one. That's a lot of information to think about. But just come up with one good recommendation a year. Just one a year that maybe redirects the institution's trajectory by 1 or 2 degrees. And then you play that out over 5 years, and we're going to end up in a very different space than we do otherwise. So for them, last spring, they gave a presentation to our Board of Trustees on competency-based education, which in a lot of parts of the college, we just as soon not talk about competency-based education because of all the reasons I mentioned. But this group, it's kind of like a little skunk works, a little think tank. They're getting it into the water in kind of safe ways, knowing that it's going to be a long process of conversation to get there. And then somebody asked me what the red triangle pointy thing is, and I don't even know. I can't. That's the unknown future, I guess. So as we think about culture, these are going back to these. It's major shifts in our organization. And what we learned in Arizona 2 weeks ago in AACC is that Guided Pathways, as you heard it before, it is not a project, it is a commitment, and a long-term commitment for true transformation of our organizations that I think for many of us in these last several years, particularly after reading the book and maybe even leading up to that, coming to that realization that, wow, we're probably not serving our students in the way that we should. As community colleges, we kind of have overdone the access bit, and it goes beyond the completion to really supporting students in new ways with their pathways. And bringing that back in front of you for the scope, that's a lot of doing, a lot of work ahead of us, and I think this notion of shaping culture, I wanted to take time out to say it's not so much, the doing part is really important, but the culture is about being. And the extent to which we can be a little more cognizant of how we're being in this work, of what we're doing. It's not just the what, but it's the how and the why. That I take a little inspiration, I guess, from the Cleveland Clinic about how we might want our cultures to be. And I love the parallel with healthcare and students. When we think about healthcare and colleges, we think of doctors and faculty and patients and students. Healthcare is a great precursor or metaphor because they're actually about 10 years ahead of us in terms of how their industry has shifted over the years and how we need to shift. In the Cleveland Clinic, some of you may have seen this, but I love this video to think about our cultures. Again, a moment to load. And to summarize that, you could say everybody's got stuff. So if we think about not just our students, but our colleagues and what everybody is walking through our halls every day with, I wanted to end with that as kind of a reminder that this guided pathways work is really individualization at scale. And if we go about that work very intentionally, trying to affirm the best aspects of our organizational culture, we'll make the most of this significant punctuation in the life cycle of our organizations and create an unbelievable new experience for our students and the power of one for every student. It's not just changing the life of that student, it's changing the life of their family and to a great extent even the life of the next generation for them. So important work that we have ahead of us, and we're thrilled to be on the journey with you. So thank you for your attention.